Today in the Daily Dose, the Manhattan Project. Cloaked in deep secrecy during World War II, the Manhattan Project was a joint research and development project between the United States, Canada, and Great Britain, with the goal of developing the world's first nuclear bomb. Led by Major General Leslie Groves of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and nuclear physicist Robert Oppenheimer, the director of the Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico. The project began modestly in 1939, but quickly grew to employ more than 130,000 people at its peak operation. 90% of the project's cost, nearly $24 billion in today's currency, was spent on building factories for the production of fissile material, while less than 10% went to the actual development and production of nuclear bombs. Research took place at more than 30 sites across the U.S., England, and Canada, yet despite its massive scope and reach, the Manhattan Project remained top secret throughout its 7-year lifespan. Two types of atomic bombs were developed concurrently, including the relatively simple gun-type fission bomb and the more complex implosion-type bomb. The first gun-type bomb, known as Thin Man, proved impractical for use with plutonium, so the project moved on to a second gun-type bomb known as Little Boy, despite the complexities of enriching its uranium-235 isotope. Nearly all of the program's uranium enrichment occurred at the Clinton Engineering Works at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which included electromagnetic, gaseous, and thermal enrichment techniques. A concurrent plutonium enrichment process was carried out at the Metallurgical Laboratory at the University of Chicago, which designed the X-10 graphic reactor at Oak Ridge, with additional reactors at the Hanford enrichment site in Washington State. These efforts would result in the first plutonium implosion-type bomb, codenamed Fat Man, which was further refined and developed at Los Alamos. The first nuclear device ever detonated was an implosion-type bomb codenamed Trinity, which was detonated on July 16, 1945, at New Mexico's Alamogordo Bombing and Gunnery Range. A month later, Little Boy and Fat Man bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki respectively, which would ultimately result in Japan's unconditional surrender on August 15, 1945, just 4 days before a third nuclear bomb was scheduled for detonation over a third major Japanese city. The Manhattan Project would formally end in 1946 after its final nuclear detonation test at Bikini Atoll, known as Operation Crossroads. In January 1947, the Manhattan Project would be replaced by the creation of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. Operation Magic Carpet. By mid-1943, long before the defeat of Germany and Japan in World War II, U.S. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall began grappling with the logistical scope of repatriating more than 8 million servicemen and women to North America, all of them spread out across 4 continents and 55 theaters of war. At the head of the task was the War Shipping Administration, or WSA, which was established by President Franklin D. Roosevelt early in 1942, whose original charter was to increase the shipping tonnage of supplies and GIs by all branches of the U.S. military in both the European and Pacific theaters of war. In tandem with the U.S. Maritime Commission, led by Admiral Emory Land, from September 6, 1945, until September 1, 1946, Operation Magic Carpet would prove to be the largest combined air and sea lift ever organized in recorded history. While Operation Magic Carpet began ferrying U.S. personnel back from Europe in late June of 1945, the operation kicked into high gear after U.S. Navy ships joined the boat lift following the surrender of Japan, including the deployment of 70 aircraft carriers, which became the GI's travel mode of choice due to spacious accommodations and amenities, including movies in the hangar decks, fresh food, hot meals, sports, swimming, and an abundance of ice cream. Other GIs were ferried home in luxury aboard passenger liners like the Queen Mary, as well as an additional 29 troop ships used to deliver some 70,000 war brides and their children to their new homes in North America. As the months ticked by during Magic Carpet, the numbers of repatriated personnel reached astronomical proportions, while the overall average return rate during the course of Magic Carpet saw more than 22,000 Americans returned home each and every month. By way of comparison, during the course of war in Europe and Japan, an average 148,000 soldiers were transported into both theaters of war on a monthly basis, while post-VE and VJ Day repatriation saw more than 450,000 GIs returned home every month of the operation. From VE Day to September 1945, over 1.4 million soldiers were repatriated, while from October 1945 to April of 1946, the numbers swelled by another 3.3 million, establishing Operation Magic Carpet as the largest mass movement of humanity ever attempted or accomplished, setting the stage for the largest post-war baby boom in American history. Operation Paperclip. As World War II approached its endgame in Europe, members of the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee followed advancing Allied troops across Germany, interrogating scientists and research facilities seized by Allied forces. After a list of Third Reich scientists and engineers was discovered in a Bonn University toilet, the newly formed Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency began ferrying German scientists and their families to the United States with the intent of harnessing German intellectual resources in the fields of rocketry, aeronautics, and biological warfare techniques. In a covert program known as Operation Paperclip, approximately 1,600 German scientists were relocated to the United States, not only to strengthen American technical and scientific know-how, but also to ensure such coveted talent and information would never fall into the hands of the Soviet Union. While President Harry S. Truman unofficially supported the operation, he banned the agency from recruiting active Nazi sympathizers, although the Office of Strategic Services, which would later become the CIA, largely circumvented Truman's edict by removing evidence of possible war crimes from a given scientist's official record. Perhaps the most notable recruit brought to America under Operation Paperclip was Wernher von Braun, who had been the technical director at the Peenemünde Army Research Center in Germany, where the V-2 rocket was developed, which would rain death and destruction on Great Britain during the early years of the war. Von Braun and his fellow scientists were relocated to Fort Bliss, Texas, and White Sands Proving Grounds in New Mexico, where they helped the U.S. Army develop ever-increasing proficiency in rocket-propelled flight. Classified as War Department Special Employees, von Braun would later become the director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, as well as the chief architect of the Saturn V rocket, which would safely launch 24 astronauts on their quest to orbit and land on the moon. While supporters of Operation Paperclip maintain that the balance of power during the Cold War could easily have tilted toward the Soviets if these post-Nazi scientists had fallen into Russian hands. Detractors, on the other hand, point to an ethical lapse on the part of American government officials, who blatantly ignored the war crimes committed directly or indirectly by paperclip scientists, who were in effect handed a get-out-of-jail-free card without punishment or accountability. Failed warbirds of World War II. Designed to engage high-altitude Allied bombers over Germany, the Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet was the world's first and only rocket-powered fighter during the Second World War, employing a mix of two volatile liquid propellants that could accelerate a comet to 39,000 feet in a mind-blowing 3.45 minutes. Placed into service in May of 1944, the Comet's inability to slow down from its top speed of 550 miles an hour proved too fast for Luftwaffe pilots to inflict much damage on slow-moving bombers such as the B-24 Liberator, the B-17 Flying Fortress, and the B-25 Mitchell, while the Comet's 7-minute burn time obliged pilots to glide back to base for a dead-stick landing. Of the 363 Comets built, the rocket plane was credited with dropping 16 heavy bombers at a loss of 13 or more of their own. A second failed warbird was the two-seat Boulton-Paul Defiant, or Daffy, which entered RAF service in December of 1939. Armed with 4 .303-inch machine guns on a power-operated turret behind the pilot, the Defiant's intended use was designed to attack unescorted bombers from beside or below inbound formations, allowing gunners to pour fire into their intended targets. However, the Defiant's ungainly weight and lack of forward firepower made the aircraft immensely vulnerable to conventional enemy fighters, especially after the development of long-range fighter escorts such as the P-51 Mustang, which could protect heavy bomber formations to and from their intended targets. Suffering heavy losses at the Battle of Britain, the Defiant found later success as a night fighter during the Blitz, before being retired to training duties near the end of the war. A third failed warbird was the Nazis' wastefully expensive V-2 Revenge rocket, which proved to be the Germans' most advanced weapon of World War II. First deployed in the fall of 1944, the massive ballistic missile carried a 1-ton warhead controlled by rudder fins and 2 gyroscopes, reaching the edge of space at supersonic speed before dropping dead stick over Allied cities such as London, Paris, and Antwerp. And while the weapon rained psychological terror upon civilians and military alike, of the 3,000 V-2s fired at Allied cities, the weapon proved far less lethal than the destructive payload of a single raid by the RAF Bomber Command, making failed warbirds of World War II some of the worst misconceptions of early mechanized warfare. Philippine occupation and independence. 10 hours after Japan's unprovoked attack against American naval assets at Pearl Harbor, Japan launched its invasion of the Philippines, which they considered a forward defensive position against an anticipated attack on the Empire of Japan by Allied forces. Lacking sufficient air cover after the attack on Pearl, the American Asiatic Fleet in the Philippines withdrew to Java 4 days later, followed by General Douglas MacArthur's humiliating retreat from the Philippines on March 11, 1942, when he unceremoniously abandoned some 76,000 American and Filipino defenders at Corregidor, which led to the deaths or murders of 7,000 to 10,000 servicemen during the Bataan Death March of April 9th to April 17th, 1942. During the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, life became increasingly unbearable for most Filipinos, including Filipino women taken against their will as sex prisoners or comfort women for homesick Japanese soldiers, while Japanese surgeons were sent over to perform unethical and quite unnecessary human experiments on native Filipinos, including amputations, exploratory surgeries, and vivisections of the stomach and intestines, all without anesthesia of any kind. Despite Japan's culture of abuse and deprivation toward Filipinos, hundreds of thousands of independence-driven Filipinos formed underground guerrilla resistance groups, striking out against the brutal conduct of the Kempeitai, or Japanese military police, which left Japan in control of just 12 of 48 provinces by the end of the war. After fierce battles on Leyte, Mindoro, and Mindanao, Allied forces fought their way onto the island of Luzon, home to the capital city of Manila. Before Japan's occupation, Manila had been a vibrant, bustling port city of some 623,000 residents, teeming with an alluring blend of American and Asian styles. Yet when the Allies returned to take it back from the Japanese, the city became a bombed-out backdrop to the biggest urban battle of the Pacific War. Forced to fight street by street due to MacArthur's prohibition on airstrikes, intended to limit civilian casualties, the fighting came to an abrupt end on August 15, 1945, the day Japan surrendered following the nuclear devastation of two of her largest cities, making the people of the Philippines random prisoners of geography during the darkest days of the Second World War. Today on the Daily Dose Special Edition, an American aircrew's miraculous final flight. Having survived 8 emergency landings and 1 shoot-down at Vipitino, Italy, the seemingly luckless B-24 aircrew of 10 brave men hit the ultimate luckless lottery on the final day of the air war in Europe, when heavy, accurate, and intense German anti-aircraft fire over Linz, Austria, knocked out 3 of their 4 engines. The ship was a mess, replete with a shot-out radio and oxygen system, a punctured and drained No. 4 fuel tank, a damaged right landing gear, and a top turret gunner wounded yet lucky to be alive. After the crew gutted the plane of all non-essential deadweight, including parachutes, pilot Bill Shreve dropped out of formation before he and his crew lost consciousness at altitude, desperately scanning the Hungarian countryside for any survivable place for a near-dead-stick landing. What they found was an abandoned German fighter base at Pech, Hungary, with a 2,500-foot runway, which immediately posed a significant problem for a heavy bomber accustomed to landing on airstrips twice its length. Knowing he had no other alternative, Shreve landed the plane over a B-17 heavy bomber that had just ground-looped when it too ran out of tarmac, obliging Shreve and co-pilot Bob Carter to stand on the brakes for a crash landing at the opposite end of the airfield. While crash landing survival rates aboard B-24 Liberators stood at a miserably low percentile throughout World War II, all 10 men aboard survived, including navigator Jerry Harriman, fill-in bombardier Frank Dietrich, flight engineer Cal Page, radio operator Wally Anderson, and gunners Carl Nickler, Don Wood, James Herndon, and Fred Whiteman. The crew was immediately set upon by Allied Russian soldats who had invaded Hungary 2 months earlier, taking the weary airmen to the Nader Grand Hotel for a much-needed meal and a good night's sleep. The next day, the downed airmen's odyssey turned surreal when they were given 3 days' worth of food, consisting of 6 loaves of black bread, 10 lengths of smoked sausage, and 1 slab of raw sow belly. Their escort was a Russian Oberlieutenant who resembled Stalin so closely that the Americans nicknamed him Joe. They boarded a train packed with Russian soldats returning to their mother country, who soon began pouring full glasses of wine for the Americans, offering toast after toast until the airmen became quite intoxicated. After Joe had consumed an equal quantity of booze, he began hitting on a local Hungarian woman, which caused several fights to break out among the Russians and the Hungarians aboard. In all their drunken rivalry, Joe and the airmen missed their getting-off point, forcing them to bivouac in a bombed-out rail station 50 miles in the wrong direction, listening all night long to front-line artillery fire at the nearby Austrian border. After several days of traveling by horse cart through heavily bombed-out Hungarian cities, the wayward airmen finally hitched a ride with a Russian artillery convoy heading back toward Russia. Frank Dietrich wrote of the convoy, "The drivers were well loaded with wine and we drove at 60 miles an hour down bad roads. Our truck was in a bad way and soon we stopped to repair a flat tire. The tools were taken out, a 5-gallon can of wine and a chessboard. While the driver worked on the tire, we shot at a nearby telephone pole with all the weapons we could find, drank wine, played chess until the Russians began a rousing game of tossing live hand grenades. A short distance ahead, a Jeep was also being repaired. It was dusk and soon became rather dark. At this point, the Russian repairing the Jeep was in need of more light to complete his work, so he simply set fire to a barn a short distance away. Light was plentiful after that. After days of misadventure, the airmen finally arrived into Odessa, Russia on May 7, 1945, one day before the formal end of war in Europe. 53 years later, Frank Dietrich and his daughter Donnie Bastiani would return to Pech, Hungary in search of where his plane went down, and after hailing a taxi at the Pech airport for the drive to the same hotel where Dietrich was billeted after the crash, the taxi driver inquired in broken English about their reasons for coming to Hungary. When his passengers explained their objective, the driver pulled off the roadway in quite animated excitement, insisting that his mother had taken a picture of the bomber as it came into land. Undone by the small world serendipity of the moment, the driver drove to his mother's house, where she gave the picture to Frank and Donnie, closing out a vivid chapter in the lives of 10 brave men. And there you have it, the final flight of an American aircrew, today on the Daily Dose Special Edition. If you like learning something new every day, subscribe to the Daily Dose on YouTube or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com. Hiroshima, the day the world went nuclear. In July of 1945, after the Allies' defeat of Germany in Europe, physicists involved in America's top-secret Manhattan Project completed its first successful detonation of a plutonium nuclear bomb at the Trinity test site near Alamogordo, New Mexico. Japan, however, despite mounting evidence of her impending defeat, vowed to carry the fight to the bitter end in the Pacific, rejecting Allied demands for surrender as put forth in the Potsdam Declaration, which threatened Japanese leaders with prompt and utter destruction should they opt to refuse. In advance of an anticipated land invasion of the Empire of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall, an invasion that would cost an estimated 1 million Allied lives, President Harry S. Truman decided over the moral reservations of Secretary of War Henry Stimson that a nuclear bomb detonation over a Japanese city would end Japan's belligerency once and for all. In response, war planners chose the city of Hiroshima, a manufacturing center some 500 miles west of Tokyo, with an estimated population of some 350,000 lives. After the 9,000-pound enriched uranium bomb, codenamed Little Boy, had been delivered to the Pacific island of Tinian and loaded aboard a modified B-29 christened Enola Gay, so named after the mother of its pilot, Colonel Paul Tibbets. On the morning of August 6, 1945, Little Boy was dropped by parachute over Hiroshima, detonating at an altitude of 2,000 feet, instantly leveling 1 square mile of Hiroshima's city center, while fires caused by the detonation destroyed another 4 square miles in the days to come. The first nuclear bomb dropped on humans detonated with the equivalent force of 15,000 tons of TNT, forming a mushroom cloud roughly 60,000 feet tall, at the same time killing 80,000 to 126,000 people, while leaving many more thousands with burns and other life-threatening injuries. Birth defects and an array of cancers would plague local survivors for generations to come. After Japan's continued belligerence, a second, more complex plutonium-239 nuclear bomb, codenamed Fat Boy, was dropped on Nagasaki, killing an estimated 39,000 to 80,000 people, while many thousands more suffered the same catastrophic burns and injuries as the victims of Hiroshima. That same day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, leading to Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, at the same time setting in motion a new form of geopolitical tension as Cold War superpowers developed nuclear arsenals under the ongoing threat of mutually assured destruction, making the day the world went nuclear a seemingly irreversible turning point in the history of man's ongoing inhumanity of war. VJ Day. After Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, VE Day celebrations in the Allied nations of Europe and America were raucous and jubilant, subdued, however, by the knowledge that war raged on in the Pacific Theater. And while the noose was tightening on the Empire of Japan, after bloody Allied victories at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the Japanese vowed to fight to the bitter end. In advance of an anticipated land invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall, an invasion that would cost an estimated 1 million Allied lives, President Harry S. Truman decided over the moral reservations of Secretary of War Henry Stimson that a nuclear bomb detonation over a Japanese city would end Japan's resistance once and for all. Japan's continued belligerence after the first enriched uranium nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima, taking the lives of an estimated 80,000 to 126,000 people. A second nuclear detonation over Nagasaki, this time a complex plutonium-239 nuclear detonation, finally brought Emperor Hirohito to the peace table.
Received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
This time around, after years of sacrifice, bloodshed, and grinding anxiety, citizens of the Allied nations celebrated the end of World War II with unabashed jubilation, including massive crowds in downtown London. In New York City, Times Square erupted like never before, as sailors climbed lampposts to unfurl American flags under a snowstorm of ticker tape that rained down endlessly upon the celebrants. Small towns like North Platte, Nebraska witnessed fireworks, parades, and an abundance of confetti, while San Francisco and Honolulu saw marching bands, parades, and still more ticker tape. To many, however, VJ Day proved to be joyous yet bittersweet in light of the war's frequently indescribable destructiveness, taking the lives of more than 400,000 Americans and an estimated 65 million people worldwide. It was too much death to contemplate, historian Donald L. Miller wrote in his engaging book, The Story of World War II. Too much savagery and suffering. And on August 1945, no one was counting. For those who had seen the face of battle, and been in the camps and under the bombs, and had lived, there was a sense of immense relief. The war, at last, was over. The Nuremberg Trials. With the intent of bringing Nazi war criminals to justice, the Nuremberg trials were made up of 13 trials in heavily bombed-out Nuremberg, Germany, between 1945 and 1949, including defendants ranging from Nazi Party officials, military leaders, industrialists, and physicians indicted for crimes against peace and humanity, including the genocide of 6 million Jews and political dissidents, lost to Hitler's final solution. Until Germany's defeat in World War II, Nuremberg had been home to annual Nazi propaganda rallies, which made the location in the German state of Bavaria a symbolic end to the Third Reich. Absent from the trials was Nazi High Command Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, and Joseph Goebbels, who had each committed suicide in the spring of 1945. During the first trial of major war criminals, all but 3 of the 21 defendants were found guilty. 12 received death sentences, 1 in absentia, while the remainder were handed down prison terms ranging from 10 years to life. 10 of the condemned were executed by hanging on October 16, 1946, while Hermann Göring took his own life the night before his execution. by ingesting a cyanide capsule he had hidden inside a jar of skin medication. The executions were performed by Master Sergeant John C. Woods, who told a reporter from Time magazine that he was proud of his work. "The way I look at this hanging job," he said, "somebody's got to do it. 10 men in 103 minutes. That's fast work." 12 additional trials would be held, lasting from December 1946 through April of 1949, made up of U.S. military tribunals rather than the international tribunal that had passed judgment on the major Nazi leaders during the opening trial. Considered highly controversial from the start, U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice Harlan Stone called the proceedings a sanctimonious fraud and a high-grade lynching party, while Associate U.S. Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas maintained that the Allies had substituted power for principle in the meting out of justice at Nuremberg. The Marburg Files. Now known as the Marburg or Windsor Files, as Germany neared surrender in the spring of 1945, a cache of buried and quite top-secret Nazi documents were unearthed by American troops near the Harz Mountains in Germany, before being cataloged at Marburg Castle by Allied intelligence officers. Within the nearly 400 tons of documents recovered, at least 60 were discovered between the Nazi High Command, including Hitler, and the Duke of Windsor, who had been crowned King of England before abdicating the throne to marry American divorcee Wallis Simpson. When Winston Churchill informed King George VI of their existence, the king insisted that the files be withheld from the British public at large. Beginning in 1937, after the Duke and his wife stayed with Hitler at his mountain retreat, the photographs of the British ex-royals with the Führer created an acute embarrassment for the royal family, followed by the Duke's May 1939 recorded message from his self-imposed exile in France, where he urged British leaders to do all in their power to come to terms with the Nazis. While the Duke's message was heard around the world, the BBC refused to air the tape, filing it away with the label that read "Important, not to be broadcast." Yet the Marburg Files further illuminated how in bed the Duke of Windsor was with Nazi officials, including a top-secret cable from the German ambassador in Lisbon to Nazi High Command, indicating that the Duke was convinced that if he had remained on the throne, war with Germany would have been avoided. But now that war was on, the Duke advocated that continued severe bombing of Britain would ultimately force his country to sue for peace. After rumors broke out about the discovery of classified German documents, the Marburg Files were published in 1957, prompting Her Majesty's Stationery Office to write about the Duke that His Royal Highness never wavered in his loyalty to the British cause. In truth, however, historians have agreed that the Duke's close alliance with the Nazis was motivated by his sense of hurt and rejection by his countrymen and his own royal family. For his part, the Duke of Windsor never lived in England for the remainder of his life. Misconceived tanks of the Second World War. After tanks made their debut during World War I's Battle of the Somme, specialization soon refined tank design into light tanks for reconnaissance, heavily armored tanks for frontal assaults on a battlefield, and fast cruiser tanks to exploit salients or bulges in an enemy's frontline defenses. But as tank designs continued to evolve during the Second World War, massive failures plagued war designers on both sides of the conflict. First and most notable was Ferdinand Porsche's monstrosity nicknamed the Maus in English or Maus in German, in response to Adolf Hitler's call for an indestructible supertank, which weighed in at over 200 tons, compared to 68.5 tons for Germany's king of the battlefield, the Tiger II. After trials commenced in 1943, The Maus developed constant drivetrain problems, with a mere 12 miles per hour top speed due to its nearly 10-inch thick armor. Only 2 prototypes were built before the misconceived behemoth was finally scrapped. Great Britain took second place in tank development fails with its Covenanter cruiser tank, which looked promising during its 1939 design phase with its oversized wheels, low profile, and sleek armored lines. By the time it was ready for combat in 1941, its armament and light armor protection proved insufficient against enemy tanks of the Axis forces, while engine cooling problems made it unsustainable for effective use on the battlefield. Of the 1,771 Covenanter tanks produced, none was deployed in combat, instead finding their only role in training new tank crews. Last on the tank fail list was Britain's second and third strike, known as the TOG 1 and 2, which was the creation of the so-called old gang of tank designers left over from World War I. Ignoring nearly every modern development in tank design, firepower, and armor defenses, the old gang instead designed a machine to refight the First World War, producing the TOG 1, which was long, heavily armored, and capable of crossing trenches and bomb-cratered terrain, no longer predominant in battlefield etiquette. Its steering and transmission systems proved to be unnecessarily complex and prone to breakdown. The TOG 2 was to follow, including a revolving turret and other much-needed improvements. However, both prototypes proved too awkward and overly complicated to be green-lighted for combat by Great Britain's War Office, making misconceived tank fails of World War II some of the biggest blunders in the age of mechanized warfare. America's first jet aircraft. With America's entry into the Second World War an almost bygone conclusion, Army Air Corps Major General Henry Hap Arnold, one of the bomber mafia development advocates during the interwar period, witnessed a taxiing demonstration of England's first jet aircraft, the Gloster-Whittle E-2839, in April of 1941. Realizing he was staring at the future of aviation warfare, in October of that same year, Arnold arranged for one Whittle W1X turbojet engine to be flown to the United States in a B-24 Liberator, along with drawings for the more powerful W2B-23 engine and a small team of British aeronautical engineers, awarding a contract to General Electric for the production of jet engines, while Bell Aircraft Corporation was chosen to design and build the nation's first jet aircraft. The result was the P-59A, followed by design improvements in the XP-59A and the YP-59A, each model replete with an all-metal stress-skin semi-monocoque fuselage with a single pressurized cockpit, electrically powered tricycle landing gear, and a pair of 2 GE J-31 turbojets mounted under the wing roots in aerodynamic nacelles. Known as the Aero Comet, the Americans' first jet aircraft carried 290 gallons of fuel in 4 self-sealing tanks in the inner wing panels, while all production models could be equipped with 2 1,590-gallon drop tanks under the wings. Flight tested at Muroc Army Airfield a year later, now known as Edwards Air Force Base near Lancaster, California, Bell test pilots Robert Stanley and Lawrence Craigie uncovered a myriad of problems over the next several months of testing, including poor engine response and reliability issues, poor lateral and directional stability at speeds above 290 miles an hour, and flight instability when firing the aircraft's twin 37mm autocannons. The nation's first combat jet proved to be a further disappointment in terms of airspeed and performance, with a maximum speed of 413 miles per hour compared to 440 miles per hour for the prop-driven P-51 Mustang and 414 miles per hour for the P-38 Lightning. relegating the 66 Aerocomets that were built for use as flight trainers as fighter jet designs and speeds improved during the early years of the Cold War. Beginning development in 1939 and deployed into combat in April of 1944, the Nazis' Me-262 would prove to be the first dominant jet aircraft in history, with a maximum airspeed of 560 miles per hour, although the aircraft became a choice target when it slowed during final approach for landing, making for easy prey when Allied fighter pilots dove down from altitude to decimate the vulnerable aircraft, making the P-59A a disappointing yet promising future in aviation combat. Today on the Daily Dose, the Japanese holdouts of World War II. Of the more than 6 million men who fought in the Imperial Japanese Army during World War II, given the remote nature of many South Pacific battlefields, some soldiers failed to get the memo that the war had ended on August 15, 1945. Japanese holdouts either doubted the veracity of the formal surrender of Japan or simply failed to receive any form of communication that their war against the Allies had been lost. For instance, on January 1, 1946, 20 Japanese soldiers hiding in a tunnel on Corregidor Island surrendered to U.S. servicemen after learning the war had ended from a newspaper they found while collecting fresh water. In late March of 1947, Lieutenant Ai Yamaguchi and his corps of 33 soldiers emerged on Peleliu to attack a U.S. Marine Corps detachment stationed on the island, believing the war was still underway. Reinforcements were sent in, along with a Japanese admiral who was able to convince the men that the war was finally over. Notable holdouts continued to surrender into the 1950s and 60s, including Private Bunzo Minagawa, who held out on Guam until May 1960, and Sergeant Masashi Ito, Minagawa's superior, who surrendered days later on May 23, 1960, almost 15 years after Japan's formal surrender. Miraculously, some Japanese servicemen continued the fight into the 1970s, including Sergeant Shoichi Yoko, who served under Masashi Ito when he was finally captured on Guam. In October of 1972, Private First Class Kenichi Kozuka held out with Lieutenant Onoda for 28 years, until he was killed in a shootout with Philippine police. In March of 1974, a full 29 years after the end of the war, Lieutenant Hiro Onoda surrendered on Lubang after holding out on the island since December of 1944, refusing to surrender until he was relieved of duty by his former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, who had flown to Lubang to formally relieve Onoda. And last but not least, Private Teru Nagamura was discovered by the Indonesian Air Force on Morotai, surrendering to a search party on December 18, 1974, a full 29 years, 3 months, and 16 days after the Japanese instrument of surrender was signed. Now that's a committed patriot. And there you have it, the Japanese holdouts of World War II, today on the Daily Dose.